Okay, what I want to talk to you about today is a lot of things, but we're going to start where the beginning is, and we're starting to talk about Israel. And understanding about Israel and the call of Abraham is going to give us some understanding when we come to the Exodus of Egypt and what actually took place, where the ordinances began for different things, and how things were supposed to work, and how they've been changed, and how things have went into a whole different development after the fact. Years later, even all the different people, the scholars, the Jews, different people that have changed everything when it comes to observing the things that God made ordinances about. And that they've been changed, but the Word of God is the only standard that we actually have to go by, and we're going to hold on to that standard, and we're going to show His ordinances, His decrees, His commands, and we're going to do that in a way where we're all able to see. Hopefully, I can make this as simple as we can get it, and we're going to take us through a little time here of explaining the beginning of Abraham. And what we're going to do is we're going to start out in the book of Genesis, when God first called Abraham. And so that's where we're going to go to right now, is Genesis chapter 12. And we'll start out in verse 1. And it says, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land I will show you. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curseth you. And in you shall all families of the earth be blessed." Okay, now we see here where God actually called Abraham out from among his own family and told him to leave them, and that he would make a great nation. Now, what nation is he talking about? He's talking about the nation of Israel. And when we consider the nation of Israel, we need to realize that all this began with Abraham. All the ordinances, all the commands, the 10 Commandments, where they came from, through God giving them to Moses, the Sabbath, the calendar system that God actually established through Moses and Aaron in Exodus chapter 12. And we're going to talk about all these things, and we're going to bring clarity in this, and we're going to talk about different things, like where people say that the Sabbath actually started on the first week of creation. Actually, it did not, and the command to keep the Sabbath did not start until Exodus 16. And we're going to prove that from the Scriptures, and we're going to prove that there was a system established by God Himself, not man, but by God Himself. And that system is still supposed to be, if we're going to follow the true way of following the festivals, if we're going to follow the Sabbath, if we're going to follow everything that God established with Israel, then we're going to have to follow the system that they followed and go with that system. If we're not going to follow it, then we can go a different direction. But I'm telling you, after I'm done with this video, you're going to see that what I tell you is the truth, if you want the truth, or if you want to hold on to the things and the lies that people have told, and the doctrines of man that they have created, then you can do that. That's your choice. And you can try to prove any other thing you want to prove, but I'm telling you, after this video, you'll see that you cannot change the ordinances that God established Himself. And if He established an ordinance, we cannot go against it if we're going to follow the system that He created for Israel to follow. Okay, what I want to talk to you now about is something else. Abraham was called, and then he got some good and bad news. In Genesis chapter 15, one of the things that he told Abraham was he told him that his people would suffer hard bondage for 400 years. And so he said that in Genesis 15 and verse 13. He said, after he told him that he would, bring forth out of his seed, he would have, bring this nation about. He said, and also that nation whom they, I'm in the wrong verse, verse 13. He said, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. So that was the next step in this whole thing. Okay, the next thing that was the step in the journey, but before we take the next step, we're going to actually consider some things here in Exodus chapter 12. This is when they began to come out of Egypt. And so Moses spoke unto Moses and Aaron. Here's where he said, and it says in Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, and the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. Now, this word month here is not month. It is actually should be translated moon. This moon shall be unto you the beginning of moons. It shall be the first moon of the year to you. Now, we can see here that God is establishing a system that he is setting up, and it is something that he's doing, and he's establishing this, and this is the beginning. And then while they were still in Egypt and in slavery, God set this up, and he told them before they could get out of Egypt, they had to do the Passover. And so he told them what to do, how to do it, and all that. But here is where he established, before they ever left the slavery of Egypt, he started telling them how he wanted them to conduct themselves and what he had planned for them. The Passover, which was in the same chapter we just talked about. Then the Red Sea, or wherever they crossed at. Now we're going to go to a place in Exodus chapter 16. And we're going to read about, let's just start in verse 1. And he said, and they said, and they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came unto the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month. Now notice the dates. The 15th day of the second moon after their departing out of the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For you have brought us forth into the wilderness to kill us, to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then said the Lord unto Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day. Notice this, a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law. And notice what this is. He says, in my law or no. And it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Okay, do you see what's going on here? What's happening here is he is establishing the Sabbath. And the thing is the Sabbath is being established so they can follow it. They hadn't been following the Sabbath up to this point. Even though God had hallowed the Sabbath in the 2nd chapter of the book of Genesis, man had not been following the Sabbath, and this is where the Sabbath actually becomes an ordinance. Most people won't catch on to that. They don't understand that this is where the Sabbath was established as an ordinance. And it wasn't enforced as an ordinance here, except for the fact that God showed them if they don't follow what He tells them to follow, there is consequences. And that's what happens here in the 16th chapter of the book of Exodus. They see the consequences of not following what God told them to follow. And the Sabbath was being established here as an ordinance. And we know that it wasn't put into the law yet until we come to Mount Sinai. And that's where we're about to come to, is at Mount Sinai. And we're going to begin to see some things that we may not have seen before, but realizing that He started the Sabbath here. Exodus chapter 19, and we'll start reading in verse 1. Now notice this is a 3-month period here that they go through. So it says, in the 3rd moon, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. For they were departed from Rephidim, and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on wings of eagles, and brought you unto myself. Therefore, if you see a therefore, always try to find out what it's there for. He said, I said all that to say this, in other words, if you obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant. Now notice right here where he said, and keep my covenant. So in this covenant, He's going to create what it is that everybody there is supposed to be following. Now it's just the children of Israel at this point. And so the covenant is going to be this is where the balance hangs. What we're talking about, this is how and where the balance hangs on the point of the Sabbath, the law, all those things, and they're all interwoven into this covenant, and there are, of course, circumstances. Then you shall be a particular treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces. Now here is where he's about to give the law. Now what is in the law? Thou shalt remember to keep the Sabbath holy. Well, they had already been following the Sabbath since it was established whenever in the 1st or 2nd month there. They had already seen God show them how to follow the Sabbath. As far as that goes, they were to rest on the Sabbath and enjoy the double portion that they had gathered the day before. And that is what He meant by obeying the law. So He makes the Sabbath the law. There was no law of the Sabbath before this point. When He established the law with them, the Sabbath was a part of it. And then He gave them the rest of the law He gave them the Sabbath and the rest of the law, and that's when this all began. Before that, there was no law of the Sabbath. There was no Sabbath given to the people before this. You can look in the Scriptures, and you'll see that the Sabbath was not given to the people. He didn't say to Adam, you need to obey the Sabbath. Here's you a Sabbath day. He didn't start the Sabbath until Exodus chapter 16. And so that we need to see that, because he was beginning to establish ordinances with them that was a part of the covenant that he was giving them, that they were to obey. Okay? You need to see that. There's no other way to look at it. I mean, people can go and try to pull things out of context and try to use things to prove that it happened before this, but I'm telling you, it did not. Okay? Okay, where have we gotten to at this point? What have we learned up to this point? We've established a few things, whether we realize it or not. And what we need to realize is that we can see God forming a law and a covenant. We've seen it with him having them practice the Sabbath as far as the whole thing goes and everything, and how things are working and how things are going here. And so we can't mix up what's going on before or after the fact, when God goes on with them and then finally makes a covenant here with them at Mount Sinai. So we need to understand that what God has done, he's done it in a pattern here. He's done what he's done in a pattern, okay? He's made this thing. He's sealed this thing. He's done this thing. He's sealing it up at the Mount Sinai, but he's starting something new that's not been done. Okay, what we need to understand is this. You can see this picture up here. There were biblical covenants. And what we need to understand is there was an Abrahamic covenant that God made. There was a Mosaic covenant that God made. There was a Davidic covenant. And then there's the new covenant. And we need to understand every single one of these. These are all something different that God did. Is it that God is changing, messing around, and doing all kinds of weird stuff? No, not at all. It's actually God promised Abraham that he would create a nation. And when he created that nation, we sing here at Mount Sinai, or we will see at Mount Sinai what has happened. We need to understand this. We need to get a hold of this. There's a covenant going to be made, and there's rules to that covenant, and how things work in that covenant. And that's something that we need to grasp hold of and not let go of. Because without understanding that there's different covenants, we really won't understand anything. And that's where we get in messes, and when we get messed up. I mean, we're not under the Davidic covenant, we're not under the Mosaic covenant, and we're not under the Abraham covenant. Actually, we're under the new covenant, and that's where we are. That's the covenant that we have chosen to be in with God. And that covenant does not have anything to do with the past covenants at all. Okay, we need to understand that. We need to get a hold of that. We need to grasp that. But in those covenants, we need to understand the rules of those covenants and what was going on. Now that we've separated the understanding here, there are different covenants and there's different things going on under these covenants. Then what we need to understand is what are we obligated to when we're not under the Mosaic covenant? And see, we need to understand that. We need to get a hold of that. We're not under the Abrahamic covenant. We didn't enter into that covenant with Abraham and God. That was God and Abraham's covenant. There was a Mosaic covenant, and we didn't enter into that covenant with God in the Mosaic covenant. That covenant was fulfilled in Christ. In other words, because they broke it, they mended the covenant. Well, there was a new covenant. That covenant is now in place with God, and it's not that God ever goes back on his covenants. In other words, he don't go back on his word, but the end of that covenant, the end of that purpose, the end of that time for that covenant has been fulfilled. And not that Israel's ousted in that. He also offers them the way to enter into this covenant. You can accept the blood that Yeshua shed and walk into the new covenant. But we're not under the Mosaic covenant. We're not under that covenant. We're not, we can't say we're not under the law, because the law will always be there for us to have to give account to, as far as breaking the commands of God and not doing those things. Okay? We need to see that. We need to get a hold of that. Now, what I want us to understand here is The reason why that I showed this was, and the reason why that I'm doing this video is to bring an understanding that there is rules that have been created in a covenant. Now, as far as the Sabbath goes, there was not a law of the Sabbath before the Mosaic covenant. There was no law of the Sabbath. Now, how was the Sabbath governed? According to the covenant that was made with Moses. And how was that governed in that covenant? We need to understand that. And if you don't understand how that was and how that works, then you won't understand anything at all about how God was doing what he was doing with the children of Israel after he made them a nation and after he entered into a covenant with them. If you don't understand that, then you're going to be lost. You're going to be messed up in your understanding of the scriptures and how they're divided and how God did different things at different times, and he made different covenants. And this covenant that he made with the children of Israel was to bring them about to another place in time. And that covenant, you have to understand what the rules were. And the rules were that the Sabbath was made a law in the covenant. It was made a law in the covenants. And so, and the covenant of the Mosaic covenant that God made on Mount Sinai. And you need to see that and how that was developed and how that was brought about and how that was, how he orchestrated it, and he showed that it was going to be a part of the law whenever he said, we'll see whether they're going to obey my law or not. And so he was making a covenant with them and giving them a law to obey. But the bottom line is that we need to understand the difference here if we're ever going to understand how the Sabbath was put into, how it was made, and then we're going to be able to come to the point where we understand there are different rules for the covenant. We can't say anything about what God did before the covenant that was made, and we can't say anything about after. But during that covenant that God made with Moses, the things that he entered into with Moses and those things that he created, then we need to understand what the rules were of that covenant. Okay? If we understand that, it's going to solve the mysteries of us getting things tangled up and messed up in the New Testament and the New Covenant. And we won't get mixed up in how that's supposed to work. All right. Now then, I really want to say a couple of other things before I go to my next point. What I want you to see here is there was rules for the Sabbath. There was a system created, and God created that system in order for it to be followed. He had to make rules of this covenant, and they were supposed to obey those rules. And the fact that they broke that covenant, there had to be bloodshed of man. There had to be a price paid, and Yeshua paid that price. He fulfilled the law. And he paid that price. He didn't break it. He fulfilled it. And then he died for the breaking of the law of man. He took the place of everyone else because he sealed it. He sealed it. He fixed it. He sealed it by his blood. Now that's something that Jews don't understand today. They're trying to say, well, Yeshua is not the Passover lamb. And they're trying to say all kinds of things. They're trying to prove that's not the point. And they don't understand the covenant. They don't understand there was a covenant made and that there was a new covenant coming. So they don't understand the rules of that covenant. And they don't understand how the Sabbath worked. They don't understand what God was doing with the children of Israel. Now, Paul explains what happened. But there's not many people that wants to hear what Paul had to say. They want to take him out of the equation so they don't have to deal with the new covenant. And that new covenant that was brought, the explanation of that new covenant was brought to the Gentiles through Paul. And the understanding of what they should follow and how they should live their lives. Okay? All right. We need to see this though. Okay. Well, I hope we've come to a place now where we can understand what's going on with the different covenants and how, they're different. What God does and each one has something different, and there's different things about it. He made a covenant with Abraham. He made a covenant with Israel as a nation, and he made a covenant with David, and he also made a new covenant. And we need to understand the difference between those. Now, in that covenant that was created with Israel, there were rules and laws that were created in that covenant. Now, the fact that they broke the covenant, there had to be alterations in that covenant. And so and when they broke it, then there had to be a sacrificial system created, and a Day of Atonement and different things going on there that was created. But there was the feast that was created, and there was a calendar system that was created to organize the Sabbath and the feast days. And they were governed by one way, and we're trying to get to that point. But I had to go through the fact that there's different rules and different things that God established that go along with each covenant and each situation. Not saying that we're not tied to anything that was mentioned or done in the covenants. Not that we're not going to go back and be under those covenants. We're under the new covenant. If we don't understand that we're under the new covenant, we misunderstand the whole point of what Yeshua did, and the fact that there was a new covenant made. And we need to understand that as well. But that it's not that we don't have the faith of Abraham. And see, God has brought us along here and given us all these things, and made us different today than everything was then. The fact is it's not that we're not obligated to the laws or the commands of God in the covenant, and so of the Mosaic covenant. But we're not under the Mosaic covenant. That covenant is no longer in place according to us. And we're not under the old Levitical system as far as the priests go. Yeshua is now the priest. And we are priests and kings of our own. We go to the Lord in prayer. We need to understand those things. There's so much to understand and so much to grasp hold of. If we forget these things, we forget what covenant we're under. And we try to mix up the covenants in a way where it causes a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of things. But if we don't understand the calendar system that was created for Israel and how they were to observe things and how they were laid out, we're going to go to Leviticus chapter 23, and we're going to establish a few things. We've already established the fact that God had them going through following the months as far as this system goes. He put things under this system in this covenant through the moon, governing the feast days and also governing the Sabbath. Now, we may or may not understand that, but the Sabbath wasn't made. We've seen that. We've talked about that. But the Sabbath wasn't made a law until the Mosaic covenant. And he started that, making it a law, and for them to obey, where they were a light to the rest of the world, obeying the Sabbath under a law. Now, the bottom line is that the law couldn't bring salvation. It had to be Yeshua that brought salvation. All the law can do is bring condemnation. And so the bottom line is what we need to see in that, and that is, it's not that we're not supposed to obey the law, or we're not supposed to break the law, which means we're obeying the law. But we have to understand the difference in living in the Spirit, as far as listening and walking in the Spirit, than being under a law. There's a whole big difference there, and we need to see that. And that system that God created for Israel, we need to understand how and what he did there, what he made a law, and how that was organized and that system. So we're going to go to Leviticus chapter 23 now, and we're going to talk about some things that are there. Okay? Okay, now we're going to go here, and we're going to talk about the Levitical system that was created. And we're really going to focus on the feast and the Sabbath here, and we're going to see how this whole thing plays out. There's an ordinance here there that we have to see the ordinance. We have to understand the ordinance. So we have to grasp hold of it. And so what we're going to do is Leviticus 23. We're going to read. We're going to start out in verse 1, and we're going to get a hold of some things here. In verse 1 it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying," in verse 2 it says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feast of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feast." Now, he starts out here in verse 3 talking about the Sabbath, the 6th day, the 7th day Sabbath. And the 6 days, he says in verse 3, he says, 6 days shall work be done. And we know how he established that by Exodus chapter 16, where he showed that they should gather their food for 6 days and gather a double portion on the 6th day. And that is where we're preparing for. That principle stayed true throughout the whole of the whole system of the covenant that God made with the children of Israel at Mount Sinai, and how He brought them through the Exodus there and trained them how to keep the Sabbath. And that principle stayed true all the way through. In other words, there was what they call the preparation day. Now, that preparation day was the same as understanding how that preparation day worked from Exodus chapter 16, how He told them they should prepare on the 6th day so they would have the provisions for the 7th day. There wasn't anything to interfere with that. Now, and so let's read it again. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation, and you shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Then it begins to go into all the feasts and explain those feasts and tell how to observe those feasts in Leviticus. Now, this system that was created here included the ordinance of the Sabbath, and the covenant that was made included the 10 Commandments. And those 10 Commandments, if we want to look at the 10 Commandments, we need to see and understand what those are, and we need to understand that the Sabbath was included. Now, I think that is Exodus chapter 20, where they actually get those laws of the 10 Commandments that were written on stone, and in those 10 was the Sabbath. Now, that Sabbath was created in the law. They weren't commanded to obey the Sabbath before the covenant. In that covenant agreement was the Sabbath. We need to understand that. And in that, we have everything laid out here in the system that was created, this whole observation system that was created in that whole covenant, how they were to observe all the rules that they were to follow, and as far as the feasts go, and the days that were set aside for special days. One, first of all, was the 7th day Sabbath, and then the feast, and they did these all year long. They walked in these things all year long, and that year was governed, these feasts and the Sabbath, under the moon. They weren't governed under a 7th day Sabbath, which means 1 through 7 from the day of creation, the first day, into the 7th day from on through until now. That's not the way that works, and it's not the 7th day Sabbath. So we need to realize that there's a difference here. If we don't understand there's a difference, then we won't understand how we're to observe the Sabbath and how it became a law under the covenant that God made with Israel, the children of Israel, at the Mount Sinai. And that was not going on before that. And so we need to understand how that was governed, how there was an ordinance made. and how all this played out, how it worked, how God set it up. And we can't make it different by saying we follow the stars, we follow the sun, we follow this, we follow that. No, these feasts and this ordinance that was created for the Sabbath was all governed under the moon, and that's how it was done. The sighting of the new moon and the whole thing was governed by the moon. That's how God set it up in these seasons. And Psalms 104 verse 19, it absolutely explains this and tells us that the seasons were governed by the moon, which meant that the seasons it was talking about was the appointed times that were set up in Leviticus chapter 23, and we need to see that. We need to get a hold of that. If we don't understand that, then we don't understand a whole lot of things. We can't say that everything was governed, like I said, we can't believe that everything was governed by something different or something other than the fact that what we have as far as how the system worked, how God set it up, how the Sabbath was included in the feast days, and how he demonstrated how to observe the Sabbath, how that principle carried on through the whole of the Old Testament into the New, whenever Jesus was here preaching and all that. We have to see how that worked and how that played out. And they had that system. They were supposed to continue to follow it, continue to go by it, and continue to live that way God set it up. Not the way that we try to figure out and put together the stars, the sun, and the moon, and all those things. We cannot change what God made an ordinance for, and how he set that ordinance up under the covenant that he made at Mount Sinai with the children of Israel. That was how it was set up. And so we have to see that, okay? Now we come to the conclusion of this video and everything about it. We've seen how God called Abraham, how he made a covenant with him, and how he promised him that he would create a nation, and that they would be a light unto the world. They would, through his seed, he would also bring salvation to the whole world, not just to Israel, but through them he would bring salvation. And that's what he promised him. And he did that. He said that all nations through him would be blessed. Well, that's his promise was fulfilled in Yeshua. And that's the faith that we have. That's how we have the faith of Abraham. That's how that faith works, is when we believe in Yeshua. Well, the same thing goes with the fact of the next covenant, which we're talking about the covenants here again. We're making a summary. We're concluding. And bottom line is, then the Mosaic covenant, there were certain ordinances that were laid out, and they were laid out in a law in the covenant that God made with Israel, which they broke. But God cleansed them and gave them an opportunity to come back to him through Yeshua. And you know, there's so many doctrines out there, man, and so many confusing things. That's why I'm making this video. So many things have been twisted and turned into something that they're not. And if we don't understand the ordinances of the covenants, we don't understand how it is or what it is we're supposed to do as children of God now, and how we're supposed to conduct ourselves and how we're supposed to live. And what was it about the Sabbath, and how was it that it was created, and how was it that it was set up? Well, there was no Sabbath before being made to do, or under a law or through a covenant that was ordained before Exodus chapter 16. We've come through all those things. We've seen how the children of Israel were in bondage for 400 years. They were getting ready to be the children of Israel. They were getting ready to be a nation, and how that God led them out and gave them ordinances about the Sabbath, and gave them ordinances about as far as the 10 Commandments go. He gave them commandments, and one of those commandments was the Sabbath. And we've learned all about the covenants and how they're different one from another, and how we can't mix them up. We can't misunderstand them and mix them up, or try to put ourselves under one of those that we're not under. We're actually under the covenant, the new covenant that Yeshua established and made. And so we have to see these things. We have to understand, and we have to know how this all works, and we have to see the system that God ordained, and he shows it throughout the whole Torah and time there when he was dealing with Israel and making them a light to the rest of the world. so that we could see their mistakes, live and their examples, and to live by those, and know that we're not supposed to break the commands of God. But we're not under the Levitical system anymore. We're no longer under that Levitical system where we take sacrifices. We accept the sacrifice of Yeshua for the atonement of our sins, and those feasts were a type and a shadow of Yeshua to come, how he fulfilled those and how he done those. Now we know there's others that have not been fulfilled. He hasn't done his second coming yet. He hasn't fulfilled all the feasts. We understand that, so we should continue to look for his coming and the light of the feast and how they proclaim that. And we need to see all that. And we don't need to misunderstand how this works. And if we're going to understand the covenant that was made with the children of Israel, we need to understand there's a new covenant now with Yeshua. And we need to understand what was in that covenant, and the ordinances were in that covenant. So we've done all that. We've brought that clear and plain, and hopefully we've seen this, and we do understand this, and hopefully we're moving along here, and hopefully we're seeing the moon is what governed the seasons, including the Sabbath. And we didn't do anything about how to look for the moon and how the sighting of the moon. We haven't done any of that, and we're not worried about that today. What this point of this whole point was they were governed in these seasons, including the seventh day Sabbath, was governed by the moon, and it was put into laid out. How it was to be laid out, to be governed by the moon, which God showed that it was started in Exodus chapter 12, that was the first moon of the year for them, and this was how they were to observe the things. He was set up and established these things in ordinances. We cannot forget that. If we're going to understand how these things work, we have to see it. Okay, well, this is my conclusion. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for participating in it and understanding what's going on here. Hopefully you've got this and you've seen these ordinances. You've seen how God laid them out, and you won't go back into Genesis chapter 1 to try to prove that that we follow a continuous seventh-day Sabbath. Instead, you need to see that there was an ordinance made, and there was an ordinance established, and that we need to see that. And it doesn't matter if times and dates that we think ought to line up. We're trying to figure all those things out and create a new system. We can't do that. And we can't make up a system of the stars and the sun, the moon, and all those, because this was ordained and governed by the moon. This is how it was set up, and this was how they were to do it. And they followed this system and these feasts and everything else through the governing of the moon. Okay? We need to see that. Hold on to that. Don't let anybody fool you and take you back to the seventh-day Sabbath, the continuous seventh-day Sabbath, and saying we can count to 7. We can't do that. Okay? All right. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of this video, and share it. Re-listen to it 1,000 times if you need to. Look at the scriptures yourself and test the spirits to see whether they be of God, and see what's going on here. Okay? Thanks a lot.